Yeah, we are just here today to listen in and to discuss with our esteemed colleague, Sarah Bruchhausen. We all know is a PhD candidate at the WIT's History Department, as well as the History Workshop. And she will be presenting her draft chapter from her PhD thesis on women in student and youth movements in the Lebowa bantustan. So without any further delay, Sarah, if you could take it away.
Thanks, Chris. Okie doke, so I'm going to try it and keep within 15 minutes. I'm hoping that people have had a chance to read the paper, because I am notoriously bad at presenting. But if you haven't, this is going to be interesting. So I'm just going to begin by situating this chapter in my broader thesis, which is titled Women and Everyday Practices of Resistance in the Apartheid Era Bantustan, Emancipatory Politics in the Lebowa Bantustan from 1950 to present. So this is the third of 5 substantive chapters. The first chapter looks at the period late 30s to early 60s and explores the role of women in the Sekhukhune uprising. It draws primarily on state archives and conversations with the works of Peter Delius. And it argues that as much as the story of the Sekhukhune uprising is about male migrant workers democratizing the institution of the chieftaincy to use as a tool of resistance against the apartheid state's imposition of tribal authorities, it's also a story about women's radical struggles to reclaim enclosed lands and fight off the imposition of the socio-agricultural policies of betterment. So that's chapter 1. The second chapter looks at the making of the Lebowa Bantustan in the wake of that uprising during the 60s and 70s. It explores the transforming spatial context of women's everyday lives as the Bantustan came into being, and shows that the related processes of forced removal and resettlement, the reconfiguration of chief and rural as tribal authorities, the extensive entry of women from the Lebowa area into migrant labor systems, and the increasing financialization of everyday life in the face of this declining subsistence lifestyles and commoning practices were all key aspects in shaping the ways in which women in Lebowa confronted apartheid oppression and, in some cases, resisted it. The third chapter is the one that I'm presenting today, and it brings the thesis into the 1980s and the high point of the anti-apartheid struggle. And the chapter that comes after this one remains focused on the 80s, but looks specifically at the experiences of women workers in the labor movement, and two very distinct ends of that spectrum. Then the fifth and final substantive chapter of the thesis looks at the 1994 moment and the post-apartheid period with a focus on women's associational life and one social change organization in particular called the Makotse Women's Club. Okay, so that's just laying out the thesis and where it's going. The main concepts that I'm grappling with in the thesis are emancipatory politics, everyday life, and resistance. And I just want to give you a basic definition of emancipatory politics that I use throughout the thesis from Rancière, which is as follows. Emancipation is the way out of a situation of minority. A situation of minority is a situation in which you have to be guided because following the path with your own sense of direction would lead you astray. Emancipation can only mean the autonomous growth of the space of the common created by the free association of men and women implementing the egalitarian principle. There's a lot in there, but that kind of sums up the position I'm coming at for emancipatory politics. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to try to give a summary of what I've said in this paper. Hopefully get to the end of it. So the chapter has really been written in a conversational form with Emily Bridges' work on Soweto's female comrades, and then a bunch of other secondary sources which focus on the Lebowa area, particularly works of Delius van Kessel's Lodge and Lachwati. I start by acknowledging that women were a minority in the South African youth movement, but that this doesn't make their role in the conception and praxis of emancipatory politics within this movement any less significant. I then look at the expansion of mass education in secondary schools in Lebowa from the 60s onwards and note 3 important factors. The first is that the expansion of schooling was directly related to the imposition of tribal authorities, and that rural communities were compelled to build their own schools with their own funds. The second is that in the 70s, the reluctance to send girls to school was dissipating in Lebowa, and by the early 1980s, the number of girls attending school on a regular basis was actually slightly higher than that of boys. Third, inside the schools, both gender and class shape students' everyday experiences, as well as their conceptions of freedom and emancipation. I go on to discuss the major protest events taking place in South Africa during the 80s and the organizational developments in the liberation movement at the national level and the ways in which these shaped the local youth movement in Lebowa as well. These include the independent trade union movement that proliferated in the wake of the 1973 Durban strikes and was given organizational impetus with the establishment of COSATU, CUSA, and COSATU, respectively. I then look briefly at the student movement's roots in the Black consciousness movement, SASO in the 1976 Soweto uprisings, and note that the establishment of COSAS in 79, and it being the UDF's largest affiliate when it's established in 1983, also provides similar organizational impetus. I note that in the township uprising literature, COSAS student activists are often portrayed as the shock troops of the UDF strategy of ungovernability. And then move on to discuss the literature that focuses on the 1985-1986 Lebowa uprising and the proliferation of youth congresses and organizations in that time. Drawing on Lechwati and Heffernan, I show that some youth organizations came about as a result of small political discussion groups linking up with COSAS activists from urban areas or older veterans of national liberation organizations such as the ANC, who were living in the bantustan at the time and often under banning orders. Other youth organizations, such as the first youth organization in Lebowa, which was the Batlokwa Youth Organization, established in 1978, held their roots in local struggles against forced removals and resettlements and had a mass base of hundreds of members from their very outset. Drawing on Delius, as well as articles and activist publications such as Work in Progress in the South African Labour Bulletin, I also explore instances in which trade unionists played a role in the establishment of youth congresses in Lebowa. Drawing on Paladi's MA thesis and my own findings, I argue that the idea of a neat movement of youth congresses in Lebowa from the townships to the villages needs to be complicated, as it does not hold true for many spaces of the former Bantustan. I then go on to discuss the 85-86 moment of mass uprising in Lebowa, and as indicated in the draft, I feel that I'm missing at least a paragraph or two describing the contentious political practices developed by the youth, which ultimately rendered the institutions and administration ungovernable. I just kind of stated, and I'm like, by this time they're unworkable, but I need to give a bit more. After that section, I argue that the historical narratives which depict the South African youth movement as starting in educational institution and then spreading out into wider township politics needs to be adjusted slightly when rural village spaces in the form of Bantustan are brought into consideration. In many villages, the popular youth movement first took root outside of schools in conjunction with wider political mobilizations in rural communities before gaining an organizational foothold inside the schools in the form of democratically elected SRC-driven student politics. It was only in the late 80s, after the uprising, that the student movement made significant headway into the majority of village-based schools themselves. I then go on to have a note on the issue of witchcraft and violence. And I note that in my own interviews, a hard distinction was maintained between the identity and practices of comrades on the one hand, and then the excessively violent actions of young men, interestingly never women, who did not participate adequately in the democratic structures of youth organizations and who were at the fore of practices such as witchcraft accusations and killings. Now, this is an issue that's disputed in the existing secondary literature, and I've tried as much as possible not to throw my hat into the witchcraft ring, because for a number of reasons. I'm not going to, because it's healthy and thriving in my lane, which is not there. And then go on to discuss what I call some of the everyday political practices of rural youth organizations, which I think are not focused on precisely because of how spectacular the particularly anthropological literature around witchcraft accusations become a bit all encompassing of the moment. So the rest of the paper is in the back of my mind, trying to write against that as well. So I say that the idea that the 1980s South African youth movement was a space of gender equality, it is one which was emphasized consistently by the women I interviewed who participated in it. There was no gender division of labor or separate structures for women in any of the youth organizations in Lebowa prior to 88. I think at that point in the paper as well, I just need to flesh out from my interviews what exactly the everyday work looked like there, which seems to have been very deliberately kind of partnered up. A male member of the movement, often with a female member of the movement, would go out for different activities such as recruitment, dealing with an issue in someone's house, if there's a domestic dispute and so forth. Anyways, I didn't write that in. I know that's necessary. Anyways, so I said there was no formal separate structures for women in any of the youth organizations prior to 88, but in that year, and in line with national developments in the South African Youth Congress policies, which was COSAS's underground successor, some youth organizations in Lebowa did attempt to create women's structures with the specific aim of allowing women to gain a stronger foothold and voice within the movement, and in so doing forge connections of solidarity between the youth and older women in the communities. However, as previously mentioned, by the late 1980s, many of the young women who had first been politicized in the youth organizations and congresses had become increasingly involved in school-based SRC and other school-based structures, which had finally taken off in most of Lebowa's villages by that period, and there was little by way of formal youth organization outside of the schools. And this is also confirmed in Delius's A Line Amongst the Cattle. But whereas Delius sees the student movements kind of petering out entirely in 87, I argue that it really goes into the schools and takes on less contentious forms or less overtly spectacular protest forms. The everyday political practices, So I talk about being a female comrade in both urban Soweto and rural Lebowa meant more than simply turning up to mass demonstrations, protest events, or political funerals. And there's an insistence in the interviews that it was only by attending the regular political meetings, which took place at night, often in their natural environments on the outskirts of townships and villages, and participating in the less spectacular everyday activities of local youth organization, including the organization and mobilization for bigger events, that a far smaller number of young women became known in their communities as comrades. And the everyday political praxis and campaigns of youth organizations in rural villages brought them into varying levels of confrontations with the chiefs and officials of the Lebowa administration. A well-documented aspect of this in the existing secondary literature is the way that youth congresses put pressure on chiefs to hand over the books detailing the tribal authorities' expenditure of funds collected from taxing communities. A less frequently explored aspect of the interactions between the organized youth and chiefs during the 80s in existing literature relates to the challenge made by the youth towards the specifically gendered forced labor practices of the chieftaincy. During the mid-80s, village-based youth organizations throughout Lebowa began to challenge, and in some cases successfully put an end to this aspect of this exploitative relationship between women and the chieftaincy. The youth's desire to constitute themselves in a fashion that was antithetical to the authoritarian and discriminatory political form of the tribal authority structures as they existed in the 80s meant that excluding women from any position or activity of the youth organization on the basis of their gender was simply never an option. That's written in a weird way, but this is the impression given through the interviews. To do so would be to mimic one of the most popularly despised aspects of chiefly rule under the apartheid regime. The fact that ordinary women, regardless of their social circumstances or marital status, could be taxed, policed, and have their labor forcibly extracted by chiefs, who could never be included as equals in the decision-making forms and structures of the chieftaincy. Limpopo is one of the number of places in South Africa where elite women, both before, during, and after the colonial apartheid periods, have maintained a highly visible and powerful presence in leadership positions of various chieftaincies. Prof. Lechwati's latest SADC chapters detail this. And the many attempts by the apartheid state and some quarters of the Lebowa bantustan administration to formally bar women from occupying permanent positions in local governments, and in some extreme instances to prevent women from engaging in public meetings entirely, was a massive grievance amongst most women in rural communities in the 80s, and one which had a great impact on the development of the youth movement. By taking a leading role in the political praxis aimed at fostering a new relationship of accountability and transparency between local governing authorities and ordinary community members in rural societies, the youth congresses in Lebowa were self-consciously putting the emancipatory political prescription of the Freedom Charter, that the people shall govern, into practice in ways that moved them subjectively far beyond their narrow interests as students or youth. In fact, on many occasions, youth organizations in Lebowa explicitly articulated their campaigns as being fought on behalf of their parents or as our parents' struggles, and were aimed at creating stabilizing features of everyday life, premised on shared ideas of what a dignified human life should look like in rural communities. Another important insight that came to the fore in my oral history research was the importance of what activists called freedom dramas as a main political practice of youth organizations often driven by female comrades. I go into a discussion of what these freedom dramas look like to an extent, because very limited sources. Towards the end of the paper, I say that one of the key claims made by Bridger is that the liberation movement was a double-edged sword for most female comrades. Whilst most women felt liberated from conventional gender roles as a result of their participation in the youth movement, since then, she argues, they have experienced stigma and judgment within their township communities because of their previous breach of gender norms. As I showed in the paper, this is not the case in Lebowa, was not the case for the woman that I spoke to, whose adoption of what I call, following Bridger, an assertive femininity, not negatively impacted on their ability to marry or their perception of being properly female in rural communities, nor did it prevent them from furthering their studies in ways that female comrades in Soweto suggested it had directly effect for them. The paper doesn't have a conclusion, but it stops at this point at the moment where I say the narratives of female comrades also report that because of the inner strength and self-value they gained during their time in the youth movement, none of them have allowed violent relationships, gender-based violence being the discussion point, or patriarchal discourses into their homes as families or adults. All the women interviewed for the project reflect on their time as comrades in the student and youth political formations of the 80s as emancipatory, a moment in which they engaged in a self-fashioned movement out of a position of subalternity and took control of their own lives and destiny. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah, for that very interesting presentation. So yeah, now I'll just hand it over to the audience, whether you're in person or online. If there are any questions or comments from anyone. And I will bring the laptop over as well. All right. Okay, so I'll take a round of 3 questions then. There is. Yeah, thanks. If it's not, and I think it's very interesting, what you talk about how outside to inside, so not the other way around. That's very interesting. Probably sort of component. But if it is that, they are giving that. There's someone in the neighborhood, there's someone what is it? And then the other point which is quite difficult is
aside from reacting to a series of experiences, directly on web, which I think is very, very advanced, that they're still getting. Did you bring a feminist side to the politics? I mean, in other words, do they actually part of the themselves that is seeking to be
Is it for you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Doing the,
yeah.
so the mute.
It was muted. Well,
Okay. Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. I was actually hoping, before I read the chapter, I was hoping it was another chapter, particularly the one from 1994, because I'm looking for material from that era. But mine is a small question. Maybe before that, I actually think your research is very interesting, particularly when we explore the role of the youth, particularly women. We know it's usually an urban focus, and it's usually Soweto, and it's something that I feel has been over-researched. And so I think it's a massive empirical gap in that regard. But I wanted to ask, you mentioned that these youth, these youth had a relationship, or they had a working relationship with trade unions, or trade unions were forming these youth movements. So I wanted to know, what was the reason? And I know it's part of the broader social movement, unionism of the times, but I wanted to know what were the specific or the immediate reasons for trade unions for doing this? Why was this a strategy for them? What did they hope to achieve? And then also looking back, when you talk to these women now, what's the sense? How do they feel? Was it worth it? Something like that. How do they feel about when they look back and reflect over this time, and when they look at the way things are right now? Was it worth it? What's the sense that you get from them? Okay, thank you.
One last question.
Okay. Yeah. So, Tara.
Sorry, Chris, were you asking me?
Yeah, Tara, if you could please ask your
Okay. Hi, Sarah. Thank you for this really interesting chapter. Really nice to read your work again. I was wondering, when reading your paper, I was thinking of this novel by Loretta Mqobo called And They Didn't Die, which is about women's resistance to betterment a little bit earlier than the time period you're working on, I think like the 50s and 60s. But one of the dynamics that she writes about that I was wondering if came up with the women that you interviewed was the role of women's religious groups like Manyanos, and what the relationship was between, say, the religious woman and the comrade woman, or whether that overlapped, whether those religious spaces also became spaces for political organizing, or whether people tried to keep them quite separate.
Cool. Thanks, Tara.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much for all those questions. You want to put this up? Oh, yeah. Oh, bizarre. Okay, I'll try go in order, starting with Clive. I don't have an answer to why. I don't have an inclination, and I think the reason I don't have an inclination as to what pattern can be extracted to help explain why certain women made this unconventional choice while most didn't. And I suspect that maybe Michael Neocosmos's idea of expressive and excessive politics could be helpful in that regard. Expressive politics being existing identity categories, your class, your race, your gender, or even your spatial location, versus excessive categories of thought, which really have no base in existing identity categories. And this probably also speaks a bit to Debiso's question about the joint up work between trade unionists and youth congresses, and even some trade unionists where they're starting youth congresses. This is followed in Delius's work. Because again, there are moments of acting beyond the politics of interest. Like, why is it in your interest as a worker to go back to a rural village and start a youth congress, dealing with issues that are not to do with your employer? And so I think the idea of the excessive aspect of any emancipatory politics being really important. It's also important to be able to name that excessive politics, but I'm not quite sure how to name it at this juncture. But I don't think it's going to be anything that lies in particular conjuncture in a particular space made it likely and obvious for you to do X, Y, and Z. I think there's a leap of faith factor. And networks, exactly, but sometimes those networks are completely, like the networks in Mogalaring are totally different to those in a Pal and Sek, totally different up in Steelport in the mining area. So it's a non-answer, I suppose, an extension of your question. In terms of the feminist dimensions of youth movement structures, so from the sources I'm dealing with, I haven't seen the women who identify themselves as female comrades as being the bastions of gender equality or women's emancipation. We're dealing with community issues and general issues at all points. And for me, since starting my thesis, that's always been important to me, is to be like, sometimes women are the bearers of universal human emancipatory politics. And then Nomaniso Gaza's work shows us that it's fact, it's very rare instances in South African history where women come out as women. And it's usually for a reclaiming of public space that's just been taken away from them. But it's always as part of a broader movement for human emancipation. And that's often missed in the work of Julie Wells and Cheryl Walker and others who are quite concerned with the fact that the class profiles don't match and so forth, so they can't be representative. So again, working with Emily Bridger, where I kind of make the statement at the beginning, like, for me, it seems almost inevitable that by becoming involved in these structures for whatever reasons, you would end up chafing against expected gender norm roles. Different in the township to in the rural areas. And I use this concept of assertive femininities, which Ariana knows I'd never define at any point. Because it's quite hard to kind of articulate, I feel. The idea of, like one of the interviewees, Mrs. Madite, discussed, we were the first generation to wear pants. And that was an issue that was a whole thing. We were the first ones to insist on staying out in these public spaces with groups of predominantly boys, regardless of the gossip happening in our homes, and working through those accusations of sexual promiscuity and so forth. But those gendered expectations are also very generational, because particularly in rural areas and in township, by the time you get older and you've gone into sort of like grandmother territory, there's a very assertive femininity that reigns, and hard labor and just the nature of the economy and everyday work in rural areas is not this Victorian, very sheltered notion of a respectable girl. And I think the discourse of respectability and its connection to domestic work in township areas is so really important, as that burden is lifted or somehow transformed in a rural context slightly. So what's interesting for me is that the women who participate in the youth movement, more than the other spheres of popular politics I've investigated, claim to have experienced gender equality in real time in that 80s moment, in these small spaces they carved out for themselves alongside other comrades. Going to my last chapter, which I'm writing up now, women in explicitly defined like women's clubs and local NGOs attempting to do the life-sustaining work projects that the youth congresses were doing for a bit before their demobilization, you know, trying to set up creches, trying to start community gardens, trying to set up waterways to the river if there's no water coming. This is the work that predominantly women's groups are doing now, but they do not articulate the same experience of gender equality, nor are those spaces themselves ones in which as soon as they go home, their husbands still think, I'm in charge and I'm the head of the family. So I haven't been able to articulate it, but I think my conclusion will do a lot of work for me, and perhaps in my chapter 6, speaking back to this, to kind of understand there's something about being in the mold of protest that allowed these gendered issues to come up and in sometimes become a point of policy. But again, that's not coming from the female comrades themselves, that's more from the community, which is mostly women. So when they bring up the issue of forced labor practices, like I would say, that's obviously a feminist aspect of the politics, but not one necessarily driven by the young women within the movement, but by those who they're claiming to represent and act on behalf of in the wider community. Okay. How do they feel and reflect back now to be so? So again, I have that very much in conversation with Bridget at the end of the chapter, where they look back at it as a moment, as an emancipatory moment for themselves. And they describe it as emancipatory in relation to the other woman who didn't get involved. And not just the other woman, but other people in general of that generation who weren't involved in student politics. And there's one interesting quote, I think it's again by Maditse, where she says, you know, our generation wasn't a redundant generation. Everyone, up to 90% of those involved have all gone on, either further their studies or get secure decent jobs and have upwardly class mobility themselves. Whereas those who haven't, their lives don't look so great. And also the few women who are involved as female comrades claim very militantly that they do not allow the gendered issues that the rest of the women face to come into their homes. Now, I'm not going to throw a false consciousness thesis and say, oh, that's very unlikely that you've got no patriarch in your home. I'd rather just take that comment for the significance of what it is as a key point in how they're reflecting back on their time. Is that even though they're in a country where gender-based violence has increased, where women are less visible in positions of leadership at a local level and so forth, for them themselves, they're like, we won't allow that into our house. And I will wear pants, and when I go to my mother-in-law's house, I don't do X, Y, and Z that she expects me of. Everyone else would. So yeah, it's a real interesting oscillation for me between the individual and the collective, and what claims can be made at different points, and also between the national and the local. And as it stands at the moment, the chapter just kind of concludes with that reflecting point. It still needs an actual conclusion that brings it back now to the beginning of, and this is off of your comments, Sarah, and you know, the discussion of how does this tie into the broader political economy, the wider national movement, and so on. Tara, sorry, 1,000 years later. And They Didn't Die. I have read that. It's a brilliant book. To be honest, I didn't really think of it in relation to this chapter so much. I was working with it. I was reading it when I was working on earlier chapters. But I can tell you that for me, interestingly, in their absence, the Mañanos, the church was an extremely important link. Absolutely. And again, it's in different spaces, right? I don't want to make a giant claim. Like Mr. Shechel, in Appel, in Mochaloreng, the Lutheran Church played a huge role, as did the Roman Catholic Church. But not in all spaces, all time. And then specifically the idea of the Mañana women's groups. Because I asked, because there's so much literature about it, the woman insists to me that because of the nature of the state of emergency and the inability to collectively gather at all, the kind of traditional women's dance groups and stuff that are adjacent to Mañanos, which today fulfill quite a linking role between different local constituencies, weren't active, except around the Mankweng area, where her group students claim that those groups were actually really important in them extending their politics out of campus. And it seems that, yeah, anyways, just, I don't want to overmake the claim, but in the interviews I've done and from the sources I've consulted, it seems that the Mañana groups started acting more as stockpiles as saving groups as deliberately uncontentious spaces for survival, and didn't really overlap in an organizational sense. In an underground sense, they very much may have, and as individuals, women would have definitely during police raids and so forth. Okay, cool. I hope, yeah.
Sorry, we do have a question, I think, from Laura.
Hi everyone. Hi Sarah. Thanks for the great paper and the presentation. I want to ask a question about emancipatory politics. So when I was doing my research, I was interviewing, I think, a very different group of women to those that you've interviewed. A lot of the women that I spoke to had been teachers and nurses, and joined groups such as Tuata, which is often thought of as this kind of more professional union or association, or Lebna, which was similarly so for nurses, and spoke rather about their experiences and what it did for them as women in some of the same terms that you're describing the women that you've spoken to, how they spoke about their past. So I guess my question is, where would you draw the boundaries, and where would you draw the lines around what counts as emancipatory politics, and how this shapes, in relation to how it shapes women's lives? Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. Is there anyone else? Any questions? Okay.
Yeah, this is going off the one of the questions. Around like how these women are reflecting on where they led up, right? And all of those seem to be like quite individual, like personal side of goalposts. And I'm wondering, because they were involved in political activity, and that's collective action, did they reflected all on like the success of the collective political sense, and how they managed to those successes? Did you find that the focus on the individual?
Then we also have a comment, but maybe we can get to that after Simpiwe's question. Simpiwe, if you could go ahead.
Thank you so much, facilitator. I find the paper quite interesting in a number of respects, and I would love to meet, with the author, to just compare notes, because my research on COSAS is within the context of the Sky bantustan, and some of the key themes that I'm picking up, for example, is the issue of these bantustans being highly repressive. That, for example, most people depend on the bantustan authorities for their livelihood, because the public service is the main employer. But you find pockets of activism still, people risking their lives and everything, to push the agenda for liberation, freedom, and political space. And you contrast that, with what activists tend to call, politics of non-collaboration, and how you strike a balance between these two, working within the bantustan system because that's the main employer, but also wanting to disengage from its politics. Because in Sky, for example, everyone, whether you work for the state or not, so long as we are within their area of jurisdiction, you had to take the Sky ruling party's, membership card. And for some public servants, subscriptions were deducted, and it was compulsory. So that's one area. When it comes to female comrades, especially young females, and in the context of repression, they tend to suffer the greater brunt of repression, because I'm picking it up that, for example, with male comrades, they could avoid to sleep wherever and change places where they sleep on a daily basis. But with patriarchy and sexism, female comrades couldn't do that because they would be frowned upon by society and by their families, regarded as being loose and all of that, and taken with suspicions. I'm not sure if you are picking up similar issues as well, in the case of Lebowa. That's my question and comment. Thanks. Sir.
I don't know, should I? Okay, no problem. We'll deal with Vincenza's comment afterwards.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for those. I think I'll start backwards with Simpiwe. Thanks very much. I feel like it's more of a comment question. I have found some similar claims that I write about in the paper, especially around the just pressures out of the family for women in terms of being accused of being sexually promiscuous when trying to attend meetings. And I'd definitely be keen to meet up and continue the discussion and see what scope there is for comparison to your work in the cis guys. So thank you so much. Then to Taz around the collective wins. So I think that the lack of the collective wins in the interviews is symptomatic of the fact that I think a lot of what the youth congresses did achieve in the 1980s isn't lasting in a lot of senses, and that which is lasting is maintained by the civic movement and the civil servant strikes that happened later in the very late 80s and early 90s. In Lebowa, unlike in the metropolitan townships where you have your civics coming up in the late 70s and early 80s, like the youth movement really happens a decade later. And in line with national conversations about trying to shift the battleground from schools to alternative spaces and to use the trade union movement, which becomes legalized in the 90s. There are definitely collective wins, but interestingly, they're not necessarily ascribed to the youth movement by the female comrades themselves. What I found interesting is in conversations with women who weren't part of the youth movement, most of whom are older, and you just talk about the youth like they were just khara running around causing kak, and they're like, but the one good thing they did was chase away those Ndunas here. Or the one good thing they did was stop those Boers from coming and demanding our labor. And so it's often around those two issues that there were lasting gains that then get ratified later in the negotiations in terms of the policy laws around gender and what that does for rural governance. Laura, your question around emancipatory politics is like really key, and it's something I think I'll only be able to fully articulate when I'm done with my thesis. Not why I'm talking to you there, talking to you here. That's where I listen to you. But if I can go back to the Rancière quote that I kind of stick to throughout, while there are a lot of overlaps between what's being experienced and felt in Lebna and in Tuata, the idea of creating inclusive projects, life-affirming social change is something that you're not going to get in either of those unions. The exclusivity of membership, its relationship with the state, and again, I'm going into some neo-cosmos theoretical ground that I haven't trod for a while, so I don't feel like I can articulate myself really clearly here. But while it has many of the same elements, it comes back to the idea of what is excessive and the excessive aspect of the political praxis, creating something new that ultimately would be radically egalitarian, not as a point of departure and as a point of arrival. So that sounds very vague, and we should probably have a copy and discuss this further, but I feel like I have an answer somewhere. That won't be like a definitive answer, but more of a continuation of the conversation. And I think it has to do with the issue of autonomy and being able to hold a particular genuine representative base that speaks to these universal principles of human dignity, of justice, of equality, in ways that these state-created sort of professional associations don't do. But again, I've probably just espoused hot air there and not say anything. But it's a really cool question, and I'd love to discuss it more with you. And I think I've covered, and hopefully I haven't left anything else in those questions. I have done some poors. I did some poors first. Strange order. Should I read the one in the comments bar?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yes, please.
Yeah, so we'll just end with Vincenza's comment where she's asking, just give me 1 sec. I wanted to ask you to speak specifically about the lack of women's structures in youth organizations across Lebowa and perhaps beyond. Up until the mid-1980s, the vast majority of women's recognized political organizing, put differently, organizing which was understood as political, across the country took place in separate structures with unions, women's political organizations, or in women's civic organizations. How might we account for what seems to be highly specific to student movements, specifically the lack of women's structures within an organization?
I would respond to that. Thank you very much for the question by saying I don't necessarily think it is that unique to the student movement. I'm just thinking to Causa didn't have, as a trade union, didn't have separate structures for women until, again, quite late, I think in the 87 moment, it was after, during joining COSATU. So it's an interesting point, and I'll definitely think on it, just because in my mind, there was something similar that happened in a lot of quarters of the labor movement as well, in terms of separate organizing for women only coming up at a later stage, if at all. So yeah, I guess maybe we just see it differently in that regard, but I'll think on it. Thank you for bringing it up.
Right. So we have another question, and then maybe we end with Laura, because I think due to time.
Thanks. Sorry, I was trying to type an answer in the chat, but my fingers aren't fast enough. I just wanted to say,
very interesting paper chapter. And I have a question. Sorry if it's not very well articulated. I can speak to you later. But the freedom dramas that you say happened in this area, do you have a sense of how much they drew from African performance traditions? You mentioned the dance groups, right? Was there overlap, or were they more of a sort of modern or Western informed? And also the sources. I think you mentioned that they read the journal Learn and Teach, but what other sources did they have? Did they listen to Radio Freedom? That's a pragmatic question, but thanks.
Yeah. And then lastly, I think we might have a response or another question from Laura.
can I talk? Sorry, I think I was talking over Kasonde. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I was just trying to respond to your comment, Sarah, in the chat, but my fingers weren't fast enough. So I thought I'd just quickly say that I mean, it's obviously a very difficult question. It's hard to pin, and there's clearly something quite different between the politics in some of these youth congresses and the unions compared to the nature of the politics in some of the more professional and conservative professional associations. The question is, what's the difference? And I wonder if one way to think about it is that the lines are actually quite blurry between these two different spaces, partially because I think some of the young women who perhaps are joining these youth congresses are a few years later becoming teachers and joining Tuata and some of these other spaces as well. And maybe while there is a clearly big difference between the two, the answer to the question is that the lines of where that difference are quite fuzzy at times. Just one thought in response to your response, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, well,
Sorry.
in response to your response, that yes, Laura, I think that's a brilliant point. I wish I had said that at you. And in fact, there's even in that's historical papers, the records of Nick van Kessel's interviews that she did in the early 90s around the UDF. She speaks to some ANC women who specifically said that they were tasked with infiltrating the Lebowa People's Party's women's units to recruit underground for the ANC. And they used to go around and encourage women to join the LPP because they're like, it's actually the ANC. This is ANC. This is why she joined. So I think those lines are totally blurred. And I think that's what's particularly challenging about using the Lebowa bantustan as a research area, because it was one of these flaky bantustans that sat on every possible side of the fence at many different levels between the liberation movement and the apartheid state. Kusonde, going to your question, I did not ask about radio freedom. Just wasn't smart enough, didn't think about it. I'll send some messages and ask. And I was those women who I have phone call contact with, who I spoke to, I will speak to and find out. In terms of, and again, in terms of what modes of drama they were engaging in, can I tell you? Didn't think. I asked what forms, right? So it was a lot of doing short skits, usually around 10 minutes long, about big events. So, you know, they would often at the commemorations of 76 and so forth. But interesting, they said, you know, got to a point where they were trying not to do the big events like Sharpeville Massacre and 76, but trying to, through Learn and Teach, New Nation, other publications, find out about struggles happening contemporaneously and draw those into, so monologues, poems, and short plays. That's the extent of the detail. And I suppose I didn't have the vocabulary in my own head to really ask further. In terms of the women's dance groups, so these are traditional dance groups, not the Kibo ones that Debs James talks about, which were set up by migrant workers. These are the home-based ones, and I can't tell you much more than that. So usually older women, and a lot of these already known dancers with some fresh choreography. So Kankale Makado, who's a SASO member at Turflo, said that he was one of the students in charge of their Azasim's program of the Rural Offensive, which was trying to increase the Turflo student politics from Mankweng Township, where it was based out into adjacent rural areas. And he said that from the 80s onwards, they would meet up with women's dance groups in the Impachlele area, organizing transport through the SRC. This before they had lost the SRC, the ANC, and got very mad in '82. And they would pick them up and then go and have a field day, usually bringing together 3 or 4 villages under the pretense of it kind of being charity, like they'd arrive with food and stuff collected from the dining hall dance group, and then have an entire day-long event where they would do fringe dramas as one aspect, community kitchen that they tried to run in connection with a woman from the kitchens in Turflo. And so, again, just to show this was obviously a organizing tactic that was quite common throughout, but unfortunately, by no fault but my own as a lazy interviewer, I didn't go down those avenues to a satisfaction. I'm 100% sure they did, and I'd be happy to pass on the numbers to you to pursue this further. Yeah, cool. Yeah, very large crowds. I mean, and it was a question that you brought up in your comments to me, Ariana. They don't really give the reader the idea of the numbers that these congresses are drawing, but it usually starts with a group of literally between 8 to 20, and by the mid-1980s, the 85, 86 period, where you have school boycotts, the schools are closed and everything. Julius makes a claim that the regular meeting attendance in most of Sekhukhune land is around 700 to 800. And this is for just the everyday regular meetings, let alone the political funeral, like Peter and Chabaleng's, which drew over 25,000. And Adelaide Tambo came from Joburg to speak. You know, there were those moments that brought in the center as well. And then more regularly, just ongoing discussion. Also didn't mention the fact that a lot of the schools from 1982 until 1986, particularly in the Sekukune area and up by Bakenburg, get hit by a series of pandemics. Bilharzia in the water, and 2 other diseases, and I can't remember that. A bunch of schools are closed for months on end because of disease pandemic. It's quite interesting up in Khamatlala, it was during the closure of the school because disease, I can't remember which one. But that's one of the women I've spoken to said that's where she started getting involved with these boys, because all of a sudden now boys were getting involved in girls' everyday reproductive labor, going and fetching water and wood and so forth, especially for other community members who had been arrested in struggles with BK Matlala. And there was this moment of the youth coming together during school closures, and then trying to develop a voice. But they didn't constitute themselves as a formal youth organization until after the unbannings of February 1990. And it seems like it was very much an external process of activists coming from outside and having the conditions of possibility now to help formally establish them. Yeah. Cool.
Great. Thanks, Sarah, for the really interesting.
Thanks everyone for all your questions. That was great.
Yeah, thanks everyone.